Hello there, everybody, and welcome back to the Disc Connected. I am here with a very special guest for me, and that is the esteemed Samm Deighan. Sam, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing well. I have always admired your work, and I don't want to lay it on too thick or anything right now, but there are so many people out there that just the name Samm Deighan being associated with a piece of physical media of any sort lately is almost a reason to pick it up by itself. So,
Thank you.
first of all, from the community, a humble thank you. And for me personally, thank you for agreeing to come onto the show.
I mean, a huge thank you for me for all the support. It's very appreciated.
For those that don't know, Sam has been involved in, it seems like, almost everything at this point, from appearing on basically every label from 88 Films to Vinegar Syndrome and Arrow, and even some of the more obscure ones. You've done quite a lot for something like Second Run and
Mhm.
breaking into some of the other more interesting titles lately, and I appreciate you for that. But you also are a writer. You've put out, is it just 3 books so far on your own?
Yeah, so I did a book on Jean Rollin with Spectacular Optical as an editor, and I co wrote a big chunk of the book. But then I have done 2 solo books. One is on Fritz Lang's film M, and the other is called The Legacy of World War II in European Art House Cinema, which came out last year, maybe.
COVID time has blended
Yeah.
like crazy. The other big thing is Sam is always present on Twitch of the Death Nerve, which is a podcast and which has led to a very robust Patreon. And I just, the amount of content that gets pushed out there is astonishing. I don't know how you do it.
I don't either because I do also have a day job, and there are definitely days like today where it's like I'm excited, and I'm actually right now in the middle of researching something for the next book I'm working on. So it's like I'm excited, but I'm tired.
Oh
That's
yeah, and
really the
this weather
combo.
can't help with that at all.
No.
It is miserable out there, and we just passed the 4th of July, and I think we got up to 98 here, but I hear out by you in some places got to like 105 even.
Yeah, I think it's like it gets around that temperature here, but it's also just so humid. Like that's the
Yeah,
real problem.
step outside feels like you're in a gross shower.
Yes.
So the big thing, obviously, I talk about physical media constantly, and obviously with what's behind you and what you contribute the bulk of your life to, you seem to appreciate it as well. So how'd you originally get into physical media and appreciating it?
Well, I guess it started from a pretty early age. I mean, I've loved weird movies since I was a kid, and pretty much the only way I could watch them was either by finding some weird shit on TV at 2 in the morning or
Yeah.
going to a video store and renting them. And later, when I had an allowance, I could buy tapes, which I wish I still had those.
Same.
But as you could see, I have replaced it with plenty of things. And there are still tapes around the house.
I've only got a handful left, but man, I really want to try to keep at least one piece from each of the physical media like eras, just to be able to show the evolution. And it is exciting to see you talk about things like that. And I'm curious, how did you originally? I mean, you said you liked weird movies from when you were young. Is there a couple that really set that off when you were younger?
Definitely Vincent Price. I'm not sure what the first Vincent Price movie I saw
He was
was.
always watching over me from behind.
Oh, yeah, it probably was House on Haunted Hill, but
Oh, nice.
I know that there were those those great blocks of programming in October where the whole month you could find horror movies on TV, and that I think is how I was introduced to him, but then it just sort of turned into trying to find every Vincent Price movie I could and classic Universal horror as well, and
Right.
just sort of went out of control from there.
So, on the contributing side, how did you originally get into contributing to some of these physical media releases?
So I think my first contribution was for Mondo Macabro's release of Symptoms. I did an
Mm,
essay for it, and this is probably 6 years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And at that point, I had been on this crazy project where I had this blog where I started this like monthly challenge for myself to see if I could write a review every day,
Right.
which is basically how I trained myself to be a writer. Like I went to school, I have a degree in English literature. So it's like I have formal training, but when you're trying to be really prolific, making yourself write every day seems crazy, but it helped so much. And I think even though it was really a project that I started just for myself, it sort of got my name out there. And I pitched them at one point blindly and said, hey, if you ever need essays, I'm this dumb idiot who has a blog. And they were like, we know who you are. She's like, what? So then they hired me to do symptoms. And around that time, I also had just started the Daughters of Darkness podcast with Kat Ellinger. And so she and I kind of got into commentaries and things like essays right around the same time.
Right. And both of you seemingly, I mean, you use the word prolific, and that is, to a point, it's kind of understating it, especially when you have a true daytime job. And I mean, if you just look at like Kino Lorber, do you know how many commentaries you've done for Kino offhand?
I don't, but when I first started, so my Patreon is a little over a year old, and part of why I started it is because people kept writing me saying like, you don't have a website.
Right.
Is there a list? Is there somewhere I can go to find all of your work? And I was like, okay, well, I'll start this. Probably no one is gonna be interested. And I think I've published maybe 2 or 3 versions of the list now. It is very long. It's kind of embarrassing. But I have this problem where when people ask me like, oh, tell me some things that you've done, I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what my name is.
Right.
I have to look at the list. It's way too long.
I believe the last version is almost exactly a year ago now. It was July of last year, and I've got that linked in the description below. And for the number of titles that you've posted on, I mean, it is astonishing that you're able to keep a straight thought, like you just said. It is beyond prolific, and literally just hearing the name Samm Deighan on a commentary, I always say on this channel that alone is a reason to buy the release. And I'm curious because the commentaries are so well thought out. Can you share even a hint of what your process is? Because they appear to be so well researched that it genuinely sounds like film school sometimes.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I do think having academic training helped because I approach doing commentaries the way I would, like, basically I set them up like I'm giving a lecture. And I usually watch the movie and note down like key scenes that I want to talk about. I'm not a big fan of the commentary style where you're just like constantly telling people what's on screen.
Agreed.
So I usually, it's like if something important is happening that I know I want to discuss, like if at the hour mark, Peter Cushing cuts Christopher Lee's head off, which, spoilers, that never happens. But if it did, it's something I would want to talk about in a commentary.
Right.
But generally, I just try to frame it the way I would a lecture. So, like, what are the major points I want to cover? Like, the people involved, the time period, like, what other films does this relate to? How is it different? And so, I mean, they are basically like little mini film classes.
They are. And when you're constructing these, are there a handful of sources that you go to, or do you genuinely just have all of this stored in your brain? Because at this point, it can't be that second one.
No, so I try to like balance it because doing commentaries is a lot of work, and there are some films that I could talk about just like off the cuff,
Right.
because it's a subgenre that I know really well, or maybe it's a director I know super well. And in that case, usually I'll just make notes reminding myself of like names that I have to bring up and dates and things like that. But there are times where I'll take commentaries where I have to do more research because otherwise it's not fun for me. It's like if
Right.
I'm not getting to I'm addicted to doing research, I think is the problem.
A lot of good a lot of good writers are the same way. So it shows, and I just appreciate that approach, because really with commentaries, there is that fine line between too scholarly and also entertaining, and that perfect balance in the middle. There's a handful of people that get there. You get there, and Kat Ellinger can get there, and Nathaniel Thompson does really well, and
Yeah.
there's a handful of others, but I appreciate that voice that can come in there and make me feel entertained just by listening to things that I'm learning. And it is a wonderful gift on some of these discs.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult balance to strike because like my brain does tend towards the academic,
Right.
but I also like the reason I wound up not, and I've been to grad school like 4 times. I love grad school. It's very expensive, but I also find academia to be not a very creatively productive place. It is exclusionary, and the way I feel about cinema and film knowledge is like everybody, and art in general, is everyone should be able to access it. And there
Right.
are definitely certain things where, watching a film or looking at a painting, your appreciation of it might be enriched if you understand some of the background, which is where commentaries come in. But it's like when it's too dry and academic and you're throwing out jargon that people might not have any context for, it's like you're trying to turn them off,
Right.
which is why I I think I enjoy being able to like let my enthusiasm come out sometimes, which sometimes is difficult to repress.
I will say the liner notes that you have contributed to as well, and even there's been some video essays as well that you've done that really they give that extra context. But my favorite thing is when they it's hard to explain. It's like they start building a bridge and make me want to go do my own research, because they're just that taste into either a certain genre or era of film, and you go, damn, I just want to know more. All she did was make me excited.
That's great to hear because that's usually how I have chronic lifelong insomnia, and there are nights where like I could have gone to sleep early, but instead I went down some like link clicking rabbit
Yep.
hole trying to just, read more articles.
What I feel like my life has turned into, because just glimpse into me, I've got two special needs kids, so I'm at home a lot and caring for them, and I'll be one of them falling asleep or something, and I'll put on a commentary and I'll open a tab on something that I need to read later, and then 5 days later I've got like 17 links that I just go through and read for hours at a time.
I
And
am the same way.
I appreciate that so much. With the process, one of the things that I try to do on here is sort of bring positivity and quell some of the entitlement in the hobby. And there are a lot of people that are, this cost too much, or it didn't get to me fast enough, or why am I, seeking out this movie for the fourth time? And just to sort of dive into why this is so important, could you share perhaps how long some of these take? Like, if you're doing all the research for some of these commentaries, a lot of people will think that you just go in and record and it's 2 hours and you're done and you get a paycheck. So why should you be worried about it? But there's a real story behind it.
Yeah, it's not like that at all. I mean, there probably are some movies like it hasn't been announced, so I can't say what it is, but I recently did like a dream commentary
Hmm.
on a movie that I have watched obsessively for like 20 years now. So I know everything about this movie. And basically, that's what I did. I just like hit record and just talked and was like, okay, well, now we're done. It's almost never like that, though.
Right.
Sometimes it's easier when you're recording with another person that you're familiar with because you're basically having a discussion with them. But I prefer to do solo commentaries because they're just easier to prepare for.
Right.
And I mean, so you watch the movie once or twice, and presumably it's a movie you've already seen a few times. And then it's, I don't know, 5 or 6 hours to make notes. Like, I make 1 page of notes for every 10 minutes of
Wow.
runtime. And that takes a long time. And if
Yeah.
it's something that's more obscure, like I recently did 2 commentaries for Kino's Miklos Janksho box set,
Hmm.
and Hungarian cinema is something that not a lot of people are familiar with. It's
Exactly.
a niche, it's an academic specialty, and years ago, Kat and I did an episode on one of his films, and we wound up going down this rabbit hole and watching like 20 films in a week and a half. And so sometimes that's what happens. It's like you spend the whole week doing research because the thing that you want to talk about is so obscure and there's very little information online or in
Right.
libraries. And so it's like you just have to pull from whatever sources you can. And it's like the more obscure it is, the more work it takes, for sure.
And obviously, I'm not going to ask you to dive into figures here, but a lot of people are under the assumption that people doing this are loaded now because commentaries make good money. And
That's
um,
not true.
some of the people that I've spoken to behind, off camera, they'll share at least a little bit of what they got paid getting into it, and it is astonishing how much this art takes and really can't give. And it's hard because to keep these releases at somewhere between $25 and $50 per release, otherwise they'd have to charge almost twice that to pay these people even a living wage.
Yeah, so I will say there are a couple, maybe like 3 or 4 regular film commentary people who probably can make a living from it because they charge high rates
Right.
and companies will pay them. They will not pay me that. So I was thinking about this recently because people ask me all the time, like, why do you still have a day job?
Yeah.
And the reality is, like, we live in an awful society where health insurance is extremely expensive and the cost of living has shot up. And so it's like a lot of I actually wrote about this recently in my Patreon and people seemed very surprised. But a lot of the people I know who do film commentaries full time either have a spouse who supports them or they're getting some sort of financial support from family. And it's like we don't make much money at all. I would
Right.
say the average price for a commentary is $300 to $500, and the work, certainly there are companies I work with, I love working with them, but they don't pay that much. And so
Right.
it's like, do I just cut them off entirely or and not have the opportunity to speak about certain films that I love, or do I just sort of accept making less money for certain films? So it's
Right.
it's like the inconsistency of how often people give you projects where, like, unlike a day job where it's like you have generally a consistent amount of work that is coming in, and whether it
Right.
comes in or not, you're getting a paycheck. And this is just so different.
And that's one of the other biggest things is this is a part of an industry that has been told it's dying for 15 or 16 years now. So there's always that question mark at the end of next year. Who knows?
Yeah, but at the same time, I always think about a company like Vinegar Syndrome, who has grown so exponentially
Yeah.
in the last 5 years. It's like now they are able to distribute for all these sub labels. And so they're getting all these incredible releases out and facilitating that in a way that likely a lot of these small labels wouldn't be able to afford to do on their own. And so it's like, obviously, it's not dying.
Right. And I'm a firm believer that it's not. I honestly still think that we are in probably either the golden era or maybe trickling down from over the last couple of years. I almost feel like the pandemic really led to a real golden period because we got some dream titles that people were able to release and more people were buying them. Print runs even doubled for some of these labels. So
Yeah.
it's an astonishing time.
Yeah, people were trapped at home with nothing to do but watch movies, and they got those stimulus checks, and
That and then they got tired of streaming, so they turned to Vinegar
yeah.
Syndrome. So one of the ways that we can support people doing this is supporting their other ventures, and one of your other ventures is these books. What can you tell me about this newest book?
So years ago, I started writing a book with the vague idea that I wanted to talk about World War II and cult cinema. And this covered everything from like sci-fi and horror movies made during the war years to movies later on after the war that dealt with that time period and the subject matter.
Right.
And it just became so insane and so sprawling that I realized, okay, this is just like if I am ever actually going to have a book that I can put out in the world, I need to find a focused topic.
Yep.
So I probably still have a whole second book that could be published after this, but this one focuses on films made from 1945 to about 1985. And they're all films that were made in countries who actively participated in the war. So, for example, I don't really talk about US cinema. I don't talk about
Right.
Asian cinema because it just the scope would be too broad. It's like those are separate books on their own.
Of course.
And I try to move loosely chronologically from Italian neorealism through to things like Come and See and some of the like the rare Soviet protest films that came out in
Right.
the 80s.
That is, I mean, obviously a very broad topic, but it leads to so many other feelings, at least in myself, when I'm looking at something like this, because of whether you look at it as inspiring or terrifying or whatever, that there is so much art that can come out of these tragic times and depressing times and hard times. And that has happened time and time again. And not even just in film, but I mean, even for the history of mankind, there are so many movements that have happened.
Yeah, people turn pain and suffering into art, and I think when they don't, then it just turns into more suffering.
Right. And a lot of what you seem to deal with and highlight and even talk about in a lot of your commentaries seems to center around this idea of protest cinema. So can you share what that would mean to you if you were explaining it to somebody who's never thought of that?
So basically, what that means to me, and I didn't really go in this direction on purpose. I just sort of realized one day, like, oh, I seem to be writing about all of these films that have kind of shared political themes or sort of
Right.
shared goals. And so a lot of the movies in my World War II book fit under this umbrella as well, where they're basically movies that are made in protest of some sort of political or governmental oppression. And I think sometimes they kick back against things like war and genocide and public traumas. But also, a lot of the films that I wrote about in the World War II book, the reason I wanted to write about the legacy of the war is because war is so often used as a propaganda tool in media.
Oh yeah.
So the movies, if like even if you watch the Hollywood movies that came out in the 40s, they're just it's like so hard to find a movie that doesn't just reek of propaganda. I mean, even Casablanca, which I
Yeah.
love, it's a propaganda film. And so these movies are generally looking at the ways in which politicians and governments and whole communities use this sort of wartime myth making for their own ends. Like people like Jean Pierre Melville would talk about how like with a film like Army of Shadows, he's basically saying not every person in France was in the resistance, even though that's what people want you to believe in the 60s and 70s.
Right.
And really, it was terrible. And so I think I tend to gravitate towards those kinds of films that either overtly or sort of more subtly have that message that something just isn't right and it needs to be addressed.
And that theme, I mean, continues through, like I said, every art form. There are multiple like eras of punk music that have come out through certain levels of
Yes.
uprising and literal oppression, and it's not just war. And that leads to today that there is still a lot of protest cinema being made. And in recent times, the U.S. has been hit with a lot of things that there's reason to protest. I mean, there's still discrimination across the board, and that is not just based on things like race, but now we are fighting this gender gap where women are feeling like they are second class citizens because the Supreme Court has turned over something that has been in place for more than what, 40 years, 45 years. And
I think close to 50.
yeah, people are now losing rights that their grandmother fought for, and it's depressing.
Yeah, I don't even know if depressing is the word for it. It just, and that's something that I found really interesting about a lot of these post war films that were ostensibly about World War II. It's like, really, they're about something else. Really, they're
Right.
about what's going on in your current time and using this much more dramatic historical event as this sort of parallel to that. And it just, it's also the sort of time where I tend to associate that kind of protest cinema with really daring, transgressive directors. Like in my book, I write a lot about Pasolini.
Hmm.
He pretty much inspired the whole thing with his film Solo, among others, but also like Rainer Werner Fassbinder and Lena Wertmuller, and just so many people who are exploring the boundaries of mainstream cinema, but also sexuality and politics and gender roles and things like that. And I just don't know that we're going to get the same quality of protest films today because I think you just don't have the same kind of freedom to be tasteless that you did in the 70s
Right.
and to be offensive,
Is
for better,
there
for better and for worse.
is there an example of a fairly modern protest cinema that you would point people towards to really dive into the genre?
This is a difficult question to answer. Yeah, I feel like off the top of my head, one of the only people whose films have consistently excited me, and I don't even know if you could call it protest cinema, but definitely transgressive cinema, is somebody like Peter Strickland, the
Hmm.
English filmmaker. And his films, I think, do something interesting where they're not quite settled into a genre. Like he made this movie called Barbarian Sound Studio that's like kind of a horror film, but not totally.
Right.
And Duke of Burgundy, which is influenced by Jess Franco movies, but it's not Eurocult. It's just like clearly thinking about those sorts of films in they're humming in the background, but
Right.
honestly, I don't know. I find a lot of contemporary cinema to be pretty disappointing. And
Oh yeah.
usually, if I enjoy it, it's in kind of a mindless way, which I know pisses people off.
No, I get that, and it's all. I mean, to be blunt, it's all watered down. I mean, even if there
Yes.
is an original voice that they are seeking to portray, it really gets lost, especially if it's associated with the studio, because they seemingly have final say, and they don't want something like that going to, you know, 4,000 screens across the U.S.
Oh, totally. And this is something that we talked about pretty recently on Twitch of the Death Nerve is this idea that, people, I think Americans in particular, are always sort of fed this line about, China is evil. Don't go to it's like it's the new replacement for the Cold War rhetoric. It's
Yep.
like, here's this obvious villain. You don't want to go there because we have freedom and they don't. But like, yes, certainly China represses people and doesn't allow certain films or political protests to happen. But like, we don't hear either. We just swipe things under the rug in much more covert ways.
Yep.
And it all has to do with money. So it's like, would I rather be living in a country that says in a blunt way, you can't do this and you can't make this film, or a country that says you can do whatever you want, except that you actually can't?
Right.
And the rules seem to change based on who's involved. And so it's like, if you're white and middle class or affluent in some way, you could probably get away with more things. But even then, to your point, it's like the stuff coming out in Hollywood is so watered down. It's like we're so far away from some of those new Hollywood films of the 70s and even into the 80s, where they felt like daring and edgy, even in the early 90s. It's like we're so far from that.
I agree. Is there, as a person that's living in society today that is female, that is not an oligarch or anything like that, is there
How do you know?
is there a protest cinema revolution that you could point to that you hope is uprising? Because to be super blunt, there's not a lot of hope for a lot of people right now.
No, there's really not. And it's funny because this hasn't been announced yet, so I'm going to try to find a way to talk about it without fully talking about it, which is a little bit challenging. But my next project that should be out hopefully sometime next year has to do with representations of political violence in cinema. And so the research I'm doing right now is all about the Japanese New Wave and the sort of associated filmmakers. And it's fascinating to me the way that people like Nagisa Oshima and Shoei Imamura and even Koji Wakamatsu, who is like far to the extreme, which I'll explain what I mean by that in a second, they're all basically leftists, some more active than others, at this very frustrating time when, Japan was doing all sorts of awful things to its citizens. Like, people were getting super sick because of all these unregulated chemicals in the water, and we're basically letting the US trample all over them. And so there's this like wild protest movement that I think felt frustrating for a lot of people. So the films in the late 60s and early 70s do this interesting thing where they are these amazing protest movies, but a lot of them are also movies that are critical of left-wing movements and are sort of, they're not afraid to say, here's where you're doing it wrong and here's where you're getting caught up in bullshit. And it feels strangely hopeful to me. I'm not sure why, but it's like, I think too often movements get like this whole idea of cancel culture that frustrates people. It's like it comes from a good place, which is people shouldn't be allowed to say whatever racist, sexist bullshit they want on the internet or in person with no consequences. And that idea of entitlement, like, well, this is America, it's a free country, I can say whatever horrible thing to you I want. It's like, technically you can, but there should be consequences for that, even social consequences. And so I think people get so narrowly focused on either you're doing the thing or you're not doing the thing. And if you're not doing everything we want you to do, then you're against us. And it just cuts out so much nuance. And I think nuance is where hope lives. Nuance is what allows people to lead the kind of diversified, free lives of their choosing.
Right.
And so to see these different filmmakers kind of exploring nuance and not being afraid to argue with each other and argue with their own movements, to me, that feels like a really healthy thing. And it's like, if some old Japanese dudes can do it in the late 60s, surely some people can do it now.
I wholeheartedly agree, and that was such a beautiful way to explain the nuance because, I mean, especially with cancel culture, this is the time for that where everybody is saying, it's time to boycott X, and if you don't and boycott it 100% across the board, you're also a bad person.
It's
But in all
exhausting.
reality, every single thing that we all buy from and support, there's a piece of shit behind it somewhere.
Yeah.
Period. It is nearly impossible to find a company that is morally true through and through, and this nuance that can allow somebody to call out something that seemingly aligns with their beliefs on their own bullshit. That's where the genuine side of things can really shine.
Yeah, and it just, I think placing blame is this thing that makes people feel better. And so it's like, rather than actually trying to figure out who or what is the cause of some sort of misfortune or suffering or what have you, it's way easier to just like point your finger and say, I was reading, I read some headline and was like, no, I can't go down this rabbit hole. But I saw some headline today that this musician who was popular like 20 years ago was trying to blame trans women for women's rights being taken away. And it was like basically she was saying that now that we can't just say women, we have to say people with uteruses or people who can give birth. That somehow has stripped away my ability to be a woman. It's like, it just means that being a woman isn't this like narrow 1950s box,
Right.
where you can't get a job, you can't have your own bank account, you can't buy property. It's like pointing the finger at some person that you don't understand, or some sort of group that you're afraid of for whatever reason. I don't know why that seems to be such a human impulse, but it's like, this is not helpful. This is just making things worse. Also, it's so illogical
Yes.
most of the time.
That's what I was about to say. It's astonishing to me that it's not bringing about a shared celebration. Like, others around you are just trying to be treated as good as you are. That's something
Uh-huh.
that we should celebrate.
And I think if you ask people flat out, like, well, maybe this is too optimistic of me, but I assume if you ask most people flat out, like, does everyone deserve to live life the way they want and have
Right.
the same sort of basic rights? I have to think that most people would say yes, unless they have some like real extreme conservative views. But for some reason, it's like there's a disconnect and people forget that core thing, and they try to like twist and turn it into like, well, it's this person's fault that I can't
Right.
get an abortion. It's like, no, I think we all know whose fault it is, and it's
I,
not
I
trans
also
women.
I also feel like some of these people are thinking that because they're getting equal rights, they're viewing it as this person having more rights than them,
Which
which
is
doesn't make any sense.
insane. Yes. Yeah, I definitely read some kind of reactionary thought like that in the 90s, where it was along the lines of like women having equal rights, especially in terms of equal pay. And it was like,
Right.
well, if they start paying women equally, then they're going to pay me less. And it's like, that, how did your brain, how did your brain make that leap? It's not like it's anyone saying, well, in order for me to be paid equally, it's not that you set some sort of company policy. It's that I want you to take money out of Joe's paycheck and give it to me.
Exactly. And that's where this entitlement that we're seeing today in the employment culture is so astonishing to me as well, because just because they're offering starting positions at McDonald's for $16 an hour and you're only making 19, that doesn't mean that you're supposed to be mad at the guy at McDonald's. Be mad at your employer. They should be paying you more.
But this is capitalism. This is how it works and how it functions, is
Right.
instead of people clearly looking at the source of their suffering, they view other working class people as competition.
Exactly.
It's like, no.
I don't understand why so many people are willing to punch below them, when in all reality, if you're looking for help, those people aren't going to be able to do anything for you because they're treated worse than you. You should be punching up.
Yeah, but punching below you is safe and easy and gives you this dopamine rush. Why do you think people become cops?
Right.
Punching below you is easy. It makes you feel
Absolutely.
bigger.
On that note, this is a great time to go back to protest cinema, and I'm curious, what are a handful that you would recommend for people now? Not just contemporary, just something that can strike emotion and have somebody really grab onto a movement.
I would say definitely Battle of Algiers is a good one, the Pontecorvo film. Um, there are so many Pasolini films that fit under this. Definitely something that I think is one of his more underrated films. Like if you're a Pasolini film, you probably already will have seen this, but Teorema, which is
Hmm.
usually translated as theorem, is this like wild anti-capitalist protest allegory about this really hot guy who infiltrates this like bourgeois factory owner businessman's family and proceeds to seduce everyone in the household, from the husband to the wife to his two adult children to the maid. And he makes them sort of radically rethink their lives, which has different outcomes for each of the characters. But it's that sort of thing that it's just like, yes, there are plenty of protest cinema movies where it's literally about a protest. Like there are some
Right.
Godard films that you could watch like that. And those I think are great too. But the films that really excite me are the ones that do it in more subtle ways, where you sort of get like pulled into the film before you really realize what's
Right.
happening. Like, I don't think political messaging is as effective when you're just beaten over the head with it. It's like you want someone to tell
Agreed.
you a good story. Definitely a lot of Fassbinder's films are like this. Certainly, I would say, I don't even know where to start with Fassbinder. He made like 45 films, they're all masterpieces. I would say Fox and His Friends is a great one to start with because it also has all these themes about class and how money makes people terrible. And even if you love someone and have a relationship with them, that doesn't mean that class isn't still going to win out in the end, or class ideology.
And
Yeah.
all kinds of his stuff just came out through Arrow, and that is seemingly the best way to get most of those right now.
Yeah, Criterion put out a bunch, but I think those two Arrow sets are so far the biggest collections.
Yeah. So are there any that not that those are not great. Are there any that are more geared towards women and what we seem to be fighting as a culture and society in America right now with the news of Roe v. Wade just a couple weeks ago? Because obviously a lot of people will go to the easy answer of Black Christmas. It was so progressive of talking about abortion before others would. Is there anything that you would point to?
I mean, Rough Cut Cinema just made a great Dirty Dancing shirt, which
Yep.
people are going to think I'm crazy. I wish I could pick up my camera. It probably won't pick up. I have a a Thai movie poster for Dirty Dancing in this like dark corner in the far other room of my house. But it's a movie that I think you would never think of as a protest movie. It has obvious class themes,
Right.
but it's another one that brings up this issue of abortion. And there's some great, more obvious ones like Born in Flames. Weirdly, also, these might not all specifically be abortion themed, but most people know Paul Verhoeven from his Hollywood movies, like Showgirls, for example, which I think is extremely feminist.
Yep.
But a lot of Verhoeven's early Dutch films are really interesting and like super relevant for right now. A lot of them are films about headstrong women who just don't fit in with society, or they're about sex workers who want to live by their own terms, and they're incredibly well written, well acted, super sensitive. Like it's clear that he was making feminist cinema from an early age. And that, I think, whenever I tell people to check out those early movies, they're always like, Verhoeven?
Right.
Like Starship Troopers? And like, yes, that one. Which is also a protest movie.
A very good one, and seems to be reeking of propaganda. But when you really look into it, the subtlety is there, and it's so much of that subtlety is so important for things that bring out empathy. When people, if they went into the movie knowing that, they wouldn't give that empathy. But when you're invested in it, and it's, oh shit, I'm 64 minutes into this, and suddenly I really care what happens to this character.
Yeah.
That's where we find that humanity.
Yeah, and I do think there are a lot of filmmakers who, through the use of like more transgressive themes, like Andrzej Żuławski is another great one, the Polish director who wound up working in France for most of his career. Most people know Possession, which he made, but he made many other incredible films that just look at how awful society is and how difficult of a time women have just trying to live, which still true.
Unfortunately.
I'm so happy to be here.
Well, speaking of happiness, let's branch out to one more really quick happy topic, and that is, I put out the beacon to people on my Patreon that I was going to have you on, and they could ask some questions, and I got some interesting ones for you. And
Nice.
I knew at least one or two of my patrons are also patrons of yours. So some that we got. One says, I've only ever heard you talk about movies that are at least 30 years old. Are there filmmakers who started working like in the mid 90s or later that you are really associated with or a fan of, somebody that you find true value in?
Definitely Peter Strickland, who I mentioned. I'm trying to think. I like a lot of Ben Wheatley's films. He's that they've worked together before. I think Ben Wheatley has actually produced some of Peter Strickland's films. I'm trying to think of other recent filmmakers. I am a little sleep deprived, and these sorts of questions I almost never get. So I don't have I don't have like an obvious answer. I mean, I saw Crimes of the Future and I'm kind of obsessed with it. So I feel like even though David Cronenberg was not born 30 years ago, he just made a movie and I was shocked that I loved it. This is a thing that really frustrates me. Like, I wish there were younger filmmakers whose work I was excited about.
Right.
And some of it it's difficult for me to find the time to see new movies that are like harder to seek out, like where I might have to actually make it to an in-person screening just with my work schedule. Like, so much of what I watch revolves around either what I'm being hired to talk about or something for book research. And so it's like when I have a day off, watching a new movie that very well might make me angry.
Right.
It's usually not a gamble I want to take. I feel like there have to be more people though. Like Brandon Cronenberg, I like his movies.
Nice. I'd agree there.
As soon as we get off this call, I'm gonna think of things and be like, God damn it.
Well, one thing I would say about that subject, which we don't really hear a lot of people talking about, is that now with the proliferation of cell phone cameras that can shoot in 4K, we have this odd like switch of power where everybody can shoot a movie in 4K theoretically with, just sitting
Theoretically.
at home. However, because of the bias in the system, everything is still leaning towards the studio films for mostly established directors or people that are in the system for some other reason. So now it is easier to shoot a film theoretically, but I almost feel like nowadays it's much more difficult to break through.
Yeah, and I think some of it is like people who are probably making interesting films that I would like are being distributed through small companies, and I'm just not seeing the titles, or like maybe I'll hear
Right.
about them later. Like there was this movie that came out a couple of years ago that I wound up introducing at the Brooklyn Horror Film Festival called Blew My Mind. It's a Swiss film
Hmm.
that it's a coming of age horror movie about a girl who turns into a mermaid, but in a really grotesque body horror way. And I liked that. But until they said, "Hey, will you introduce this?" I was like, I don't even know what the fuck that is.
Right. Yeah.
So
Wow.
it's like they're out there. There's also another movie from around that time called The Falling that I really liked, which it has some Picnic at Hanging Rock vibes. So it's like people are trying to make these more interesting movies. Knife Plus Heart, I loved.
So good.
See, I told you they would come out eventually,
Uh,
but
I
they don't get the big distribution.
Exactly. And I will use that as a sort of bat signal moment to say, when you get an opportunity, please take the moment to not only support these labels. I mean, Shout Factory gets a lot of money. They don't need that. But if you have the opportunity, things like Indiegogo, young filmmakers that are doing something and trying to fundraise to support even a short film, it goes a long way because a lot of these people that you love nowadays, they started as filmmakers that were doing short films and could
Yeah,
barely cobble together a couple $1,000s from friends and family, and you might be supporting the next Fassbender or the next Ben Wheatley or somebody like that.
yeah. Please, people, I need to see the next Deathbed, which is a movie that I genuinely love, but like nobody's gonna make it if they can't get the funding to buy a 4K phone.
Well, I would be remiss right now to not shout out another young filmmaker named Michael Keane, who's another YouTuber who has a film that he's trying to fundraise for right now, and his tagline is literally "Feed the bed," and he's going to have a giant bed-shaped vagina, I think is how it's going to be, and
Love it.
it sounds incredible. So please, please go seek him out. Next question is: you post some wonderfully in-depth articles on your Patreon. Is there ever a plan to maybe collect all of them and release it as a book?
So this is an interesting question that I have thought about. It's I would actually probably have to talk to someone with law experience,
Right.
like an entertainment lawyer or a publishing lawyer, but sometimes I post things on my Patreon that are for a book that's going to come out.
Mm.
Like a couple days ago, I posted an essay on Men Behind the Sun, which is for a book that I'm working on about extreme Hong Kong cinema. And it's honestly become a really good barometer for me to sort of like balloon test, like what do people think about, and it's not even a full chapter, it's just like a section of a chapter. It's
Right.
like, what do people think about this? And people seem to love it, which like I ultimately write because I enjoy writing. So it's like I'm writing the fucking book anyway. But
Right.
it's like if I hear that people are happy about it, it's like, okay, I sort of have an idea of here's what I did in this chapter. I can do similar things in other later chapters. But there are all these older essays that I've written that just like a lot of them I wrote for Diabolique, which you don't make any money through them.
Right.
So like theoretically, I guess I could collect things and publish them as a book. I didn't know that people would really have interest in that, but I guess if someone's asking you, maybe they do.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd pre-order that. Absolutely. Just to be able to have it all together, it would be wonderful.
I would have to figure out how to pack, like what theme.
That's a good point.
Yeah, there's so
But
many.
yeah, and that's the hard thing is, and that leads into the next question beautifully. Is you have this knowledge for everything, but it seems like throughout a lot of these releases, you're simply tied to like Eurocult stuff. And I'm curious how you're diving deep into Eurocult after Eurocult after Eurocult, and then suddenly they announce Nine Lives of a Wet Pussy, and Sam Deighan is doing a commentary on there. How do those beyond genres compared to what your normal titles? How do those come about for you?
I mean, I really hate being pigeonholed in Eurocult, and I
Right.
love a lot of Eurocult movies, but there are two reasons I hate it. The first is I just don't like being pigeonholed. It's only ever researching and talking about one thing is boring, and boredom is like the ultimate evil for me.
Absolutely.
The other reason is like not to, you know, say anything too off color, but I think among these sort of cult movie label releases, the Euro cult titles are in really high demand. And so a lot of film critics are really territorial about it. And
Right.
so there's just like a lot of drama and cattiness. And like at the end of the day, I just want to do research and write and talk about movies. I don't want to deal with people's bullshit.
Exactly.
So it's like I would rather not do Euro cult movies and not be involved in it. So but it's sort of, it's also like once I make it clear to people, and not always, but definitely sometimes when I make it clear to people that I, can do commentaries about hardcore films or about Hong Kong cinema,
Right.
it's like those opportunities have started to show up, which is great. I mean, Vinegar Syndrome, they're my favorite company to work with. They've always treated me really well. They usually, if I say, I want to do something, or if they ask me, hey, we need a commentary for this, it's like they're, I think they're open to me doing different things than Eurocult. And part of the reason why I've really enjoyed working with 88 Films is because they were the first people to offer me a Hong Kong commentary on the Shaw Brothers Come Drink With Me, which is like the first 60s wuxia film. And
Yeah.
I wrote them back. This is a couple of years ago. And I wrote them back. I was like, this, like, I grew up watching these movies. I love them, but like, this is not my established area of expertise. Like, are you sure? And they were like, yeah, go for it. And now I'm writing a book on Hong Kong movies. So
Wow.
sometimes I think having people show confidence in you, it like helps you have more confidence in yourself,
That's very true.
which is a really like reading rainbow answer, but
I mean, to a point, it kind of ties into a lot of the stuff that we were talking about too, with the oppression. And if you are so hopeless in so many of these situations and you get that opportunity, it can literally change your life. Just one simple opportunity.
yeah, and I think a lot of it is about connection and community and people supporting your work or offering you opportunities or listening to your podcast or you're watching your YouTube show. It's like it I think a lot of the time it costs people nothing to support each other, to show enthusiasm for what
Yeah.
makes someone else excited, but it means so much more than this sort of awful capitalist, like individualistic, like I just have
Right.
to get ahead of everyone. It's like, do you? What, there's nothing up there.
Agreed. Yeah, that's the biggest thing, and a lot of times nowadays, the biggest thing that you can do is just share so that more people can get eyes on it, and it literally takes 10 seconds and not a dime from you. So if you can share some of Sam's work, if you can share, excitement about a release, if you can do something to, somebody is interested in World War II, bring up the book that she wrote. It's not that hard just to share good art.
Thank you. Yeah, I think in starting my Patreon, I have definitely seen a that side of people come out so much more. We started a Discord where people are super enthusiastic. And even so, I primarily a couple of years ago used Facebook as my like most frequent form of social media, and it just was so toxic
Right.
that I left and went on Instagram, and so far all I've seen is just like people sharing each other's stuff. And maybe it's just because I'm following movie nerds and not any like diet or gym culture people, but
Well, I will leave with one last really cliche, easy question here is I'm sure there's a handful of amazing Grail titles that you would love to do a commentary or a liner essay for. Other than the one that you said that hasn't been announced yet, is there anything out there that you would just love to put in the ether that hopefully someday you could do some work on?
any single Fassbinder film. I've watched them all. I've written about all of them for my old blog. I wrote a big, huge chapter on his work for my World War II book, but I've never gotten to do anything with an official Fassbinder release. And so that's my yes, there are probably 24 things that I could list off, but that's like the one real.
And so many of his films don't not even just don't have a release, but they don't have a good release. They don't have anything on recent formats. There's so
I
much out there
know.
that still could be done.
Yeah, he made this totally crazy Western movie called Whitey that I am obsessed with. And so it's like if I had to pick one, knowing that I don't think it's had a proper release yet. Like, come on, world. People want a Fassbinder Whitey or a Fassbinder Western called Whitey on Blu-ray.
I would agree with that, and it sounds like something that a lot of people would buy into almost immediately. So that's pretty much it. Sam, thank you so much for your time. I know that you are extremely busy and doing something like this takes a lot of time and prep and negotiating sleep and sweat and everything for. So I appreciate you. Everybody, all of Sam's links for Patreon, for the book, for anything else that I can find is below. Is Instagram your preferred? Everybody should follow you there. Is there somewhere else that you would recommend?
That's the easiest.
Got it. Well, as usual, thank you everybody for watching, and tune in next time. Thanks for everything. Have a good night.
Thank you so much.